So picture this. A massive oil tanker is seized on the high seas. One country screams piracy. The other calls it law enforcement. We're going to dive into the really dramatic seizure of the oil tanker, the Skipper, and what it tells us about the incredibly tense showdown between the U.S. and Venezuela.
You know, when a warning this blunt comes from a major U.S. senator, and it's a sentiment you hear across the political spectrum, you know the stakes are just incredibly high. This is way more than some maritime dispute. It's a genuine flashpoint that could ignite a much, much bigger conflict.
So how did we get here, right? To the actual brink? Well, this whole thing isn't just about one ship. It's really the climax of a maximum pressure campaign, a huge test of international law, and a geopolitical chess match that's playing out right now in the Caribbean. Let's break down the moves that got us into this standoff.
Okay, so first up, let's just look at the operation itself. We're talking about a really high-risk maneuver, a complex, almost military-style seizure, all happening in the dark, out on the open ocean.
And man, it all happened so fast. On December 10th, you've got U.S. forces rappelling from helicopters down onto the Skipper. Almost immediately, the White House is calling it a major win. Caracas fires right back, calling it piracy. And then, not even 24 hours later, Washington doubles down, slapping fresh sanctions on more shipping companies and even on Nicolas Maduro's relatives. This was a very clear 1-2 punch designed to just crank up the pressure.
So it's probably no surprise that the US and Venezuela have two completely, totally different stories about what went down. And it's right there, in those clashing narratives, that you find the real heart of this political conflict. This really captures the divide perfectly. On one side, you have the U.S. position. This was a lawful action against what they called a sanctioned shadow vessel with supposed ties to terrorist groups. But then, on the other side, you've got Venezuela's view. This was a straight-up, modern-day act of piracy, a superpower literally stealing its most valuable resource. I mean, these are two narratives that just cannot coexist.
And the reaction from Venezuela wasn't just, a diplomatic protest. President Maduro got up there and gave this incredibly fiery speech, using the whole incident to rally support at home, telling his people to be warriors. Rhetoric like that, well, it shows you just how seriously his government is taking this. They're framing it as an act of war that demands a powerful response.
All right, so Venezuela keeps using that word, piracy. But does that claim actually stand up, under international law? Let's unpack the legal side of things.
So, according to international law, the definition of piracy is actually really specific. The key is that it has to be committed by private actors for private gain. Think old-school pirates on a wooden ship, not a nation's military.
And that's the crucial point. Because this whole operation was carried out by U.S. government forces acting under an official warrant, it just doesn't technically count as piracy. Now, using the word piracy is powerful. It's great political rhetoric, but it just doesn't fit the legal definition. So that brings us to the real question. If it wasn't piracy, what was the U.S. government's legal argument for boarding a ship in international waters?
Well, the U.S. basically built its case like a ladder, one rung at a time. First, they argued that the Skipper was flying a fake Guyanese flag. Now, under maritime law, that's a big deal. It makes the ship a stateless vessel. And here's the key. International law says any nation's warship can board a stateless vessel. On top of that, they added that the ship was already under U.S. sanctions for alleged links to terrorist groups, and bam, that's Washington's official legal justification.
This whole incident wasn't just contained to the Caribbean. The shockwaves from this are being felt in oil markets and in capital cities all around the world.
To get a grip on the economic impact, you have to start here. Venezuela was already being forced to sell its oil at a massive discount. We're talking about $15 per barrel below the market price just to get anyone to take on the risk of buying it. That's a huge blow to their number one source of income.
And now, shippers and buyers are facing a completely new kind of risk. It's not just about getting fined anymore. It's about the very real possibility of having your multi-million-dollar cargo physically confiscated. So the big question for Venezuela's economy is, how much bigger does that discount have to get now? This seizure is basically a powerful intimidation tactic, and it's designed to choke off Maduro's main supply of cash.
And this seizure sends shockwaves through a whole global network. You've got China, the main customer, now seeing its oil supply threatened. You have Russia, a key political ally for Maduro, watching its influence get challenged. Then there's Cuba. They were expecting half the oil from this one ship, and now they're facing a potential fuel crisis. And of course, all of Venezuela's neighbors are just watching nervously, worried about the instability this whole thing could set off.
U.S. officials have literally called this the new stage of their policy. So the question is, where does this new stage actually lead?
Generally speaking, most experts see two possible roads from here. The first path is the one the White House is hoping for. All this extreme economic pressure cripples the Maduro regime, and it either forces them to negotiate or it just collapses from the inside. But the second path, well, it's a lot darker. It's the one where this seizure provokes some kind of retaliation, which then sparks a dangerous cycle of escalation that could lead to an actual military conflict.
And that brings us right back to where we started. That feeling of dread in this quote, you can really feel it in Washington. The seizure of the skipper wasn't just a simple law enforcement action. It was a really bold power play out on the high seas. It definitely pushed the boundaries of international law, and it may have just edged an entire region a lot closer to conflict. And now, the whole world is watching to see what happens next.